about to start our meeting with Dr. Ranjit Brar. We would like to first welcome you all. We are very happy to have people joining us for the first time. This is, we think, a very defining moment where more and more people realize that the Palestinian issue cannot be brushed under a carpet. Last Saturday, our comrades were in the streets of London in another demonstration that was very dynamic, very lively, and it was injected with new life because of the student movements, because of the so many universities that now have an incumbent, and that fills us indeed with a lot of hope. We gave around 3,000 of these leaflets, and that's despite the fact that Dr. Ranjit Brar, unfortunately, because of his bail conditions, is not allowed to join us in the streets of London. He's banned from attending any demonstration. But since his arrest, Ranjit and our party, and of course the Palestinian cause, has been meeting with new people, and more people understand the importance of receiving education and understanding the history of Palestinian resistance. So today we are celebrating the resistance, one of the most long-standing resistance movements in the world. And we commemorate the events of 1948, what is known as the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. So after the talk, we will also be playing some inspiring revolutionary resistance songs to commemorate the Palestinian resistance, and you're more than welcome to stay to share some food with us that comes from the Middle East. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Dr. Ranjit Brar, who, as you know, is one of the many people who have been persecuted for telling the truth about Palestine and about the genocide that takes place there. And after his talk, also we'll be screening a short film about the resistance. So please stay, and welcome to Ranjit.
Comrades, thanks so much for coming. It's great to see so many old faces and some new ones. I'm going to try and stick to the structure of my talk as I've made the slides, because there's so much information. You know, the Palestinian resistance has been going on really since the First World War and before, and we're going to touch on some of that background. We're here, of course, to remember and commemorate, as the march did just a week ago, the 76th anniversary of the Nakba, the catastrophe. And this beautiful, tragic but beautiful and heroic spirit of the Palestinian people is encompassed in this beautiful flyer that was made by one of our comrades, Yafa, Middle Eastern comrade for the event. And for those who don't know, this lady is 76, symbolizing the length of time that the Palestinian people have been displaced and dispossessed. And this very old iron, crude and primitive key, it reminds me of the keys that would operate very big doors to farm compounds in India when I was a child. That's a real key. That's a key to a Palestinian homestead that those who are displaced by the Nakba took with them and have become a symbol of their dispossession and their desire to return to their homeland, their right of return. So thank you to Yafa for this. I'm going to draw very heavily on this talk. You know, there's nothing original, and in a way, you feel like nothing needs to be said. Everyone should know this story, but of course, our media functions to prevent people from knowing the basic facts of the case, and in particular, we're living through this period which is like a second Nakba, a second catastrophe befalling the Palestinian people. And always, if you look at the media, they'll behave as if this all just happened from October the 7th, 2023, and nothing before that existed. and any reference to it is terrorism and illegal. And it's important that we go back and remember just what is the history of the region that's brought us to this place. So I'm going to draw very heavily on a book. Again, this is not new to us, so we've kind of come to some attention of the movement through this recent repression. But we've been campaigning around this issue for as long as I've been alive, as long as my parents have been alive, as long as they've been politically active, you know. So this is not a new question. So this book, I would really say, if you haven't got it, I would ask you all to get hold of a copy. It's Imperialism in the Middle East. It's written by my father, Harpal Brar, who at the moment it's in India and due to his health can't be with us. But I'd like his dedication, which is in the very beginning of this book. And it's a book which covers more than just the Palestinian question, as we'll see. It covers the entire, area of the Middle East. And really going from before the First World War, from the Victorian era, right up to the modern day meaning really the kind of 2003 Iraq War. And then beyond that, there's a further book, if you really finish that, Imperialism and War, with specific reference to the Middle East and Yugoslavia, which brings us almost to the present day. And that work is a compilation of the articles and analysis that we've written, principally at the time in our journals, Proletarian and Al-Kar. And that's the ongoing project to bring that mass education to the working people, to empower them for their struggle. So please, if you haven't got those books, get them. If you're not subscribing to that journal, please do so. And that book, Harpal wrote, is dedicated to the national liberation struggle of the Palestinian people, who by the colossal scale of their self-sacrificing heroism, steadfastness and perseverance have become the cutting edge of the entire Arab people's anti-imperialist and national democratic revolution, which will sweep away imperialism, Zionism and medievalism alike. And Harpal wrote that in 2002. And you can see he's not ahead of the curve, but this has been happening for some time. So we're in this defining moment. We've seen the incredible crimes that are committed. This, in particular, was a wake-up moment, wasn't it, in October last year, when it seems that the Zionists are able to bomb hospitals with impunity, claim they didn't bomb the hospital, say it was the Hamas who bombed themselves, just like it was Russia, no doubt, who blew up their own pipeline in Nord Stream. And more than that, they blew it up, a hospital, something that if it happened anywhere else in the world would be denounced as a war crime. But they weren't penalized, they were rewarded. Rishi Sunak, what did he do? He journeyed to Israel to stand with Netanyahu and to make a briefing in which he said, we stand with you and we want you to win. And all the time that we think about the terrible suffering of the Palestinian people, the atrocities being committed against them, there's a steady flow of weapons, material aid, logistics, military support, actual mercenaries fighting on the ground to help Israel continue to commit this genocide. So we can't say that it's an accidental phenomenon, that our government doesn't know what's happening. They are actively complicit. So the Nakba, the catastrophe, happened 76 years ago. And there's some pictures of it there. These are actually pictures of, I think, the Stern Gang, who are groups of Zionist paramilitaries who went on to become essentially the Israeli Defense Forces, but at that time were Zionist militia working with the British. And we've talked a little bit about the keys, and this is pictures of the effect that some of their terrorist action produced in displacing fully 700,000 Arabs at the time, Palestinian Arabs, from their homes and expelling them from Palestine. And I just mentioned briefly as well one more book which is very useful to get. It's very brief, it's a thin book, it's a little read. It's called Zionism, a racist, anti-Semitic and reactionary tool of imperialism. I gave this recently to my comrade Adam. He found it incredibly powerful. He's Palestinian, he's versed in the struggle, he's a communist, he's studied in the Soviet Union, but he found it incredibly powerful as a summary of the actions of the British imperialists to foster, nurture and introduce Zionism. So even he would learn something from it. I would suggest that even you, versed as you are in the question, if you haven't read it, would learn something from it. This is George Habash. It's a beautiful photo of him. One of my great heroes, a communist who founded the PFLP, and at the time of the Nakba, he always cited in his autobiography, in his writings, his experience of the Nakba as a very pivotal moment that made him a revolutionary. And this is something you see again and again, an act of great violence and terrorism against a body of people who previously weren't revolutionaries has a salutary effect in recruiting them for the resistance struggle, because they're suddenly confronted face to face with the brutality of an imperial system, the brutality of a system of oppression they're facing, which draws them into the struggle. We've seen it in Bloody Sunday in Ireland. We've seen it in Bloody Sunday leading to the October Revolution. And George famously said, "It's a sight I will never forget. Thousands of human beings expelled from their homes, running, crying, shouting in terror. After seeing such a thing, you cannot but become a revolutionary." And this is what we're talking about, that simultaneously with the declaration of the borders of Palestine, which we'll come to and explore later on in the presentation, there were acts of systematic terror to expand those borders of the Israeli state even beyond what was granted by the UN mandate, to drive peoples from their home, and through those acts of terror to drive Palestinians from Palestine. And they were never given, of course, the right to return. And there are the scenes of the massacre of Deir Yassin, painful as they still are to look at. You know, we can't spend the whole presentation just talking about this single act of terrorism, which is terrorism perpetrated by the Zionists against the Palestinian people with the help, collaboration, encouragement, and in aid of the interests of imperialism, without putting it in context. And that context, which we have to explore, and which is really beautifully documented in much more detail than I'm going to be able to go in the presentation here, is oil. It's the First World War and the struggle to redivide the world. There's another small pamphlet, which again Harpal has written, really because this is absolutely central. It was central to our understanding of why the October Revolution happened. It's central to our understanding of why socialism is necessary. It's central to our understanding of the century in which we're living, the struggles that the people of the world are facing to rid themselves of poverty and exploitation. And then we're going to come specifically to the Sykes-Picot Treaty, the secret treaties which led to the First World War, and then touch upon Israel and Zionism. There's a few slides, and some of them are a bit wordy, and you'll find I'll skip over a lot of them, but this I'm going to read to you in full. We're reading Marx Capital, some cadres from our party, and it's a beautiful work, sometimes not just the main work, but the footnote. So this is a 15th footnote to chapter 31, and it's something that's very profound. It says, "Capital is said by a quarterly reviewer to fly turbulence and strife, and to be timid," which is very true. But this is a very incompletely stating the question. Capital eschews no profit, or very small profit, just as nature was formerly said to abhor a vacuum. With adequate profit, capital is very bold. A certain 10% will ensure its employment anywhere. 20% certain will produce eagerness. 50% positive audacity. 100% return, 100% profit, will make it ready to trample on all human laws. 300%, there's not a crime at which it will scruple, nor a risk it will not run, even to the chance of its owner being hanged. If turbulence and strife will bring a profit, it will freely encourage both. Smuggling and the slave trade have amply proved all that is here stated. And if anyone needs any proof of that, they only really need to look at the history of colonialism in any country. Indian colonialism, just as much as colonialism in the Middle East. But we're going to look at that history of colonialism, and you need to understand what lies behind these incredible crimes, which on the surface seem so senseless. They're not senseless. It's precisely capital being bold, being prepared to trample on all human laws in pursuit of maximum profit. And really, you know, Harpal writes in the introduction to his book, he who would understand the economics and the politics of the Middle East from the beginning of the 20th century, so for over 100 years now, must really learn to spell, pronounce, and really grasp the significance and meaning of just one word, oil. In the beginning there was Rockefeller, and if anyone's ever read the history of the robber barons, apart from the railway magnates, Rockefeller is a brilliant case in point of how he picked the choke point of oil found out how to monopolize the refining industry. Through monopolizing the refining industry, took the whole industry within his hand. And then subsequently, when the US public balked at the concept of competition, they brought in this fake, which we still see today, this fake anti-monopolies type commission. You just split your holdings into several apparently different businesses which you retain control over. And ultimately, the rise of these seven sisters, which were primarily 5 companies derived from the Rockefellers, and 2 which were British, one Anglo-British. So Royal Dutch Shell is Dutch-British. British Petroleum, which started out as the Anglo-Persian oil, is British. And the other 5 major players are essentially American. Now, that was then. There are now different oil companies which have arisen, and we can talk of the modern Seven Sisters. But for the time being, we'll just see that these players had an incredible role in shaping the modern history of the globe. When the history of the 20th century is written, oil will have more than its fair share of entries in the index. If you removed petroleum and the combustion engine, the most important economic development of the past 100 years, things would have been very different. And really, the quest for this black gold, to think of that popular Tintin book and a series of popular Tintin books, explain how the powers carved up the Middle East in the aftermath of the First World War, and actually a succession of conflicts since, right up to Iraq 2003, Syria, Libya, the response to the Arab Spring in Egypt in 2011, the Yemeni situation, and right up to Ukraine. And this is why. Say 2/3, and this is still the case today, despite lots of very great oil reserves being found elsewhere. And it really explains more. If you look at Venezuela and the oil found under the Orinoco and the turbulence that country's been through precisely because of the riches that can be found there, 2/3 of the known global reserves are located in the Middle East. And of these, the tiny group of the Gulf Cooperation Council, so just going around the So just going around the coast, you're talking about Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, Oman, and Saudi. Between them, control half the world's oil supply. So Marx long ago explained that the significance of cheap raw materials is incredibly important to capital. The other things being equal, the rate of profit falls and rises inversely with the price of raw materials. The cheaper you can supply yourself with raw materials, and of course labor, the more you can maximize your profit. And so the development of monopoly actually has intensified the scramble between the major imperial powers for domination of the globe. The more capitalism is developed, the more strongly the shortage of raw materials is felt, the more intense the competition and the hunt for sources of raw materials throughout the world, the more desperate the struggle for the acquisition of colonies. And these photos, you'll remember these pictures, many of you? You know where those photos are taken? It's all Iraq. Okay, Iraq War, so the mass mobilization. This really is the last time that imperialism, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, really felt safe to mobilize mass of its army, invade and trample on the sovereignty of another country. Since then, we've seen the rise of the proxy war. We're not going to really touch and talk about that so much, but you see the proud Welsh Guards, British Union Jack, the butcher's apron flying over the tanks as they going into Basra and Baghdad. Huge conglomerations of troops, and we were presented this moment, the toppling of Saddam Hussein, as if it was a real moment of revolution and justice, that the people of the Middle East had risen up and taken control over their country. But the reality was, what we weren't shown was there was the US pulling it down using a tank. And that would really be a much better symbol. And there are other symbols now as well of the US, before they pulled it up, draping the US flag around his head. This is a far more adequate symbol of what really happened. This was US going in and recolonizing a territory which had far too much wealth simply to be left to the native inhabitants of that land. And it's this that still, we have to understand the enormous profits generated by the energy companies which underpin these incredible acts of violence and turbulence. Oil became particularly important as a commodity. All commodities, the search for all commodities is important. Bolivia can be toppled to get hold of their lithium. Congo can be toppled, the government very regularly to get hold of their coltan. So it's not just oil. But oil became particularly important, the commodity of commodities, precisely because it became the chief source of energy that fueled the whole of the industrial machine. And very, very importantly, in 1911, the Navy, the Royal Navy, also switched from coal power to oil power to power its naval vessels. It became the mechanism even for powering the imperialist war machine. So no wonder that the Middle East has become a center for major contradictions, both between the imperialist countries and the oppressed peoples, such as the Palestinians, the Iraqis, the Afghanis, the Syrians, the Libyans, etc., but also between the rival imperialist powers as they struggle over who was going to get the lion's share of that loot. 2 world wars, the wars in the Middle East, right down to the present day, the establishment of the Zionist colonial state, and the alliance between our own imperialists and various feudal medieval relics that they use still to control Jordan, Saudi, all of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries are incredibly important. And we've seen this, haven't we? The constant interference in Iran right up until last week, when suddenly the president of Iran is downed in another mysterious helicopter crash and no one knows what happened. And the Iranians themselves are being careful not to point the finger of assassination at Israel, because they actually have a far greater plan. And we're going to see, actually, maybe we'll touch upon it when we come to the 1967 war, that already in 1967, 1973, Egypt, the Egyptian generals had realized the best tactics to deal with Israel, and that actually possibly a long war was needed to play to its weaknesses. And I think that the axis of resistance, as it's rising now, has this in its mind and doesn't want to be drawn into a situation where the US is dragged into open confrontation, but is content not to recognize it. You know this picture? Half the map seemed to be painted pink. You know what the pink represents? This was absolutely, yeah. You see a lot of these maps and they talk about the spread of tuberculosis and the spread of malaria, but no, this is the spread of the British Empire. And absolutely, I'm going to put you that it was as a disease that was, inflicted on a vast mass of humanity, because those people who fell under the tender mercies of the British Empire, there's a kind of, we like to think, the Germans were terribly brutal, weren't they? Terrible what they did in their colonies. And obviously the Holocaust is a disgusting thing that's peculiar to Germany. But I'll encourage you guys to get another book called Late Victorian Holocausts, which examines just a few of the terrible crimes that British imperialism, in its far longer history of 200, 300, 400 years of dominating the globe, has inflicted on the peoples of the world. That's the extent of the empire. Now, up in the corner here, you can see the kind of pre-World War I. This is the empire at its height. So this is pre-World War II, actually, map of British possessions. And you can see, as it relates, India was always considered the jewel in the crown, okay? If you don't know India, because this was its most populous colony, the source of its greatest wealth. It acquired it early. It fought wars of independence against Britain and was subdued and properly conquered. And for a long time, one of the chief concerns of the Middle East was this. It was the Suez Canal and the waterway being the shortest sea route to India. The sea lanes to India was important to their communications, to their trade routes, to maintaining their sway over India. And so Britain became, long ago, the dominant power in the Middle East. It was interested in that trade route to India, and it controlled, in the end, 2/3 of the coastline of the Arabian Peninsula. Aden, Yemen, where we're still yet to see the end of its colonial wars. Muscat, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait. And with the occupation of Egypt in 1882, Britain really had total mastery at that time of both the Red Sea and the Gulf, which we know are such key waterways, both for trade, being as they are at the junction of 3 continents, Africa, Europe, and Asia. And so they've been of significant stretching all the way back to the Crusades. But particularly now, with Britain's colonial possessions, it's a gateway of the colonial possessions. And then with the rise of oil, every single one of those states, as we've seen, became more important. And oil was discovered in Iran on May the 26th, 1908. And this moment is looked back to by Anthony Sampson as a moment that changed modern history. It spurted 50 feet high out of the barren ground around Abadan, Persia, and it transformed the Middle East. I talked about briefly already 1911, when the Royal Navy itself started to use oil as its main source of fuel. And in fact, it was so important that in 1914, so just 3 months before the outbreak of World War I, the British government, imperialist government, secured 51% control of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And incredibly, in 1901, thinking that they were with a mind to exploring and prospecting for oil, thinking it was present there, the Grand Vizier of Tehran was persuaded to give a concession twice the size of Texas to British. That's what started off the Anglo-Persian Oil Company for just 20,000 in cash, 20,000 in shares, and 16% of the profits. And you can imagine how well that paid. So as you come to the Middle East in 1914, you can see that the entire region is dominated by largely the French and the British, and of what key importance it was. And during World War I, Lord Curzon, who you may know was the kind of supreme commander of the Allied forces, he said the Allies floated to victory on a sea of oil. Tanks, planes, ships, motor vehicles, all the decisive means of weaponry as well as manufacture was increasingly dependent on oil, and whereas the USA had a certain amount of domestic manufacture, Britain and France relied on their domination of their Middle Eastern colony for access to oil. From that point on, from the discovery of oil, it became a question of the scramble for these riches. And it was principally at first dominated by the French and the British, but increasingly the US, as they were the rising power, were jostling continually for their right to a certain share of that wealth. So this is the history of the Iraqi oil company. We wonder why, to this day, Iraq has been subdivided in the way it has into 3 zones, because if you take away Kurdistan in the north, you take away the marsh Arabs in the south, you've siphoned off the oil and you leave the population again free of their oil and you can take it out. So even right down to the present day campaigns, the oil, the actual map of the world should really signify where the oil wealth is, where the mineral reserves are. Of course they don't. This is all hidden from us. There was an agreement essentially between the French and the British with a little bit of, this is actually an Armenian businessman who helped to open these territories with his connections to the British and the French. And the Deutsche Bank were also party to that. During the First World War, that was suspended, and after the First World War, the Deutsche Bank's share in this company was awarded to the French. And then subsequently, the US were very angry to be excluded, and ultimately, they were let in. Now, this is very important, okay? We talk a lot about the October Revolution. October Revolution means a great deal to us. Lenin, at the time of the First World War, said, along with all the socialism, world war is coming. Every single party in the war portrays it as if they're defending the interests of small nations, and they're fighting wars of self-defense against aggressive hostile states. But the socialists all over Europe, all over the world, realize that's not the case. These people are the biggest thieves, they're the biggest slaveholders. And what's happening is Germany and Turkey and perhaps Japan are rising to become big powers late in the day, and they want a share of the world which is already divided up amongst themselves. And the real reason for fighting World War I was a fight over colonies and territories. And the British, the French, and in fact the Russians, the Tsarists also, were party to a treaty to divide Turkey. They said at the end of World War I, they were fighting to defeat Turkey and the Austro-Hungarians to take their imperial colonies and to parcel them out amongst themselves. And they had a pre-existing agreement, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Russians, when the October Revolution happened, the Bolsheviks took those agreements and published them. This fact became widely known because of the October Revolution, because the Bolsheviks said, this is precisely what our governments have bled so many of you for. 14 million people died in World War I, 60 million in World War II. With the exception of the Soviet Union in World War II, those powers were fighting for protection of their colonies, protection of their right to loot, protection of their slaves, and expansion of their colonies. This was an anti-imperialist war. So this was their agreement. They were going to take this whole area, which, as we've seen in the previous slide, can you go back to the previous slide? One before that. Okay, so this area was the Ottoman Empire. And you see, had a pre-existing between the French. You see particularly why the British wanted this area to connect their territory. Lots of oil they knew was going to be there. And they wanted to join up their territories, okay? And you can see why the French were actually promised part that was actually in what's become modern-day Turkey, which the British were clever enough to realize they wouldn't be able to hold because they wouldn't be able to take Turkey itself, even if they took its Arabic colonies. But you see, essentially, they were fighting for the partition of this land, and Britain already had a great deal of it. And it would like to complete its empire, become like a monopoly board. When you've got enough, you constantly want a bit more. Okay, so if we come back to the Sykes-Picot, and you can see the zones that are separated there, you can see where the borders fall. Iraq, Britain went straight away after World War I into missions of actually subduing these colonies, right? Imposing governments, quelling any revolt amongst tribesmen. And Palestine, it had its eye on. And if you listen to their states like Lord Palmerston, they say the thing to do is not to, openly state your aims, but just to maneuver yourself in such a way that what you want falls into your hand. And they were very keen to make sure that that was indeed the case. It was the British who principally backed the House of Saud and their emergence as a power under their tutelage. But at the last minute, actually US was able to step in and maneuver to become the main oil companies. So it was SoCal, which was Standard Oil California, and Texaco, who ultimately got the lion's share of Saudi oil. But it was thought important enough, it was such a rich concession, such a large amount of money to be made from taking the oil from this ground, that at the end of the World War II, when President Roosevelt was going back from the Yalta Conference. So he died just before the end of World War II and Truman took over, but this was his last kind of major play on the international stage. He was one of the few presidents the only one who had 3 terms. So it was the end of his 3rd term. He was very popular. He was thought of as a great democratic leader, brought the New Deal in America. But he went to Tehran, he flew back on his way and met with and feted Ibn Saud, the leader of the House of Saud. And he wrote to his foreign secretary, Stettinius, and he said, I hereby find that the defense of Saudi Arabia is vital to the defense of the United States. And really, Saudi Arabia and the Royal House of Saud has been a part of the American empire ever since. Winston Churchill tried to court him, but was unsuccessful. And before I'm going to come to Palestine next, but it's worth reflecting that, this same quest also explains the history of Iran, that its nationalist president, Mossadegh, who came to power precisely because he wanted to nationalize the wealth, the vast wealth that set off this whole process of colonial wars in the Middle East, back to the people of Iran, who we know are a populous country, an extremely clever and sophisticated population who are one of the cradles of civilization. But it was considered sufficiently important to maintain that actually Kermit Roosevelt, who I think was the nephew of President Roosevelt, was sent as a CIA agent, and you can actually read his story. That now it's so long ago they think you can openly say it. They were like bragging rights, and that this is what they think is the classical swaggering days of the very beginning of the CIA. This and their interference in China, trying to subvert the Chinese Revolution. This was the origin of the CIA, and the real old boys of the CIA talk about all their exploits and the crimes they committed. But they overthrew Iran, and it was really then they took those oil reserves and divided them up between those original 7 sisters, the 5 sisters being Standard Oil, New Jersey, California, New York, Texaco and Gulf, British Petroleum and Anglo-Dutch Shell, Persian Oil, Royal Dutch Shell. And the French got a little bit, but mainly between the Anglo-American imperialists. And you can see why even with the decline of Britain as a colonial power, where they have such complementary interests in terms of they still act together everywhere. The US has the main army, US has the main military spending, but financially in terms of their capital, they still act as a single whole. And all of these actions reveal it very well. Coming back to Palestine, looking at a brief timeline. This is a picture of, do you know who that is? It kind of says there. Can you read it? This is Ronald Storrs, okay? So he's watching here the men of the 1st Egyptian Infantry Battalion ascending the steps leading to the Mosque of Omar, 12th of April, 1918. And if we look at this relationship between Britain and the Middle East and Zionism in the Middle East, you'll see that it's the same relationship, okay? And I wanted to visit all of that history just so you realize, once you've said that history in a concentrated way, it's very obvious what's happening in Palestine. It's not a mystery. But somehow we never are presented Palestine in that context of this scramble for this vast amount of wealth, which has shaped every fact of history of our lives, and we know those facts of history, but somehow they're not constructed in a way that help us to see the clear picture. So since the 1880s, the first Jewish settlers have arrived in Palestine, but at first it was a small marginal movement. In 1896, Theodor Herzl published Der Judenstaat, and this book really was considered to be the origins of the modern Zionist movement, though really it predated it slightly. In 1916, there was an Arab revolt. In 1917, this was during the First World War, the Arab revolt was against the Turkish Ottoman Empire at the time. But the 1917 Balfour Declaration we're familiar with and we'll touch upon in a second. And it was during the war that the British had their conquest of Palestine, because they were fighting during the war actually with Indian armies, and some of the Indian generals who later went on to, or the British generals who later went on to commit the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, had been disgraced in the war, in the First World War, actually in the battles of Mesopotamia, in trying to conquer these very lands that we've just been talking about. We're always told to compartmentalize and not see these histories as contiguous and one. But they are the same. So this British general who went on to commit the Jallianwala Bagh massacre had been someone who was fighting in Iraq, and it was the British who liberated Jerusalem. Liberated meaning they occupied Jerusalem. But at that time, we're going to talk about it, but we'll say that. So during the war, they occupied Palestine for the first time, and by 1922, they were able to get the League of Nations to award Britain the mandate to govern Palestine. Not the only mandate. There were many German territories, including in Africa, which were that mandate. I think Namibia was one, which were given, they were handed from Germany to Britain, because these, as childlike people, the colonial people, were not considered fit to govern themselves and rule themselves. And if you read Paul Robeson's writings, he attacks this idea very powerfully. But nevertheless, that's what was done. It was kind of, they don't say, we won their colonies and we took them. No, a mandate was awarded to govern, to prepare them for independence. Childlike people will raise them to full humanity, maybe in 100 years, maybe in 200, maybe in 1,000. Sooner or later, don't worry, we'll raise you to the point when you can take control of your own destiny. And then we're going to see the partition of Palestine under the mandate, officially after Britain had withdrawn its mandate, but under the supervision of Britain and the UN, and the State of Israel declared. And it was at that point of declaration of the State of Israel, even though Israel was awarded a disproportionate amount of the land compared to their population and their actual land ownership of the Jewish settlers, it wasn't enough for them, and they then initiated a wave of terrorist violence to drive the Arabic Palestinian population from more and more of the land, and ultimately that's when the Deir Yassin massacre happened. This is what Theodor Herzl said. You may or may not be familiar with Theodor Herzl. This is him. This is a picture of him. This was his book, The Jewish State. And he made it explicitly clear, the link between Zionism and empire. So don't take my word for it. Take Theodor Herzl's word for it. He said, these are his words, not mine. I'm not a terrorist. I'm not an anti-Semite. Don't arrest me. These are the words of Theodor Herzl. For Europe, we shall create there in Palestine an outpost against Asia. We shall be the vanguard of the civilized world against barbarism. England, with her possessions in Asia, should be most interested in Zionism. The shortest route to India is by way of Palestine. And so I believe in England that the idea of Zionism, which is a colonial idea, should easily be understood. Yeah? Can you make it any plainer for the simple Simons who tell us this is about democracy, freedom, being anti-racist? And this is long before the Nazis have come onto the scene. There's been no Holocaust of the Jews in Europe, though clearly there's been a historical legacy of persecution of the Jewish population. There's nothing to do with that. This is a colonial idea, and it was a colonial project from its outset, in the words of its founders. And therefore, they worked towards the position where that was accepted by actually the ruling class of Britain. And so this is Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, and I'm not going to read the actual words now, you'll be able to read them yourself. It's a very short letter that was written by Arthur Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary of the World War I government, to and it was written to Lord Rothschild, who was just a British billionaire who happened to be of Jewish origin and saw its utility of Zionism as a colonial project. So it was written basically a letter from one member of the imperialist government to one very important member of the imperialist ruling class, affirming the role of Zionism, that it would therefore from that moment on be a key strategic part of British colonial interests. And Arthur Balfour himself said, the four great powers are committed to Zionism. And Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-old traditions, in present needs, I think that's the key one, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. Whatever deference should be paid to the views of those living there, the powers, in their selection of a mandatory, themselves, as it turned out, do not propose, as I understand the matter, to consult them. We're not interested. So democracy, that's all very well and good. We're not interested in what those people think. We have made our choice and taken our course. But this wasn't new. There are old Victorian designs on Palestine. And Viscount Palmerston wrote to, and that's a picture of him there, wrote to Viscount Ponsonby, who was then the British ambassador to Jerusalem as early as 1840, that Jewish people, if returning under the sanction and protection and at the interest of the Sultan, would be a check upon future evil designs of Mehmet Ali or his successor. So already they're realizing this is going to be a key area of economic interest to us. We need a section of the population we can use to create a loyal base, a base of a European outpost of our colonial empire that we can rely upon. And, actually, Theodor Herzl, as we'll see, has appealed to many different colonial powers at the time, and chiefly the Zionist movement has appealed to and made an alliance with the dominant imperial power at the time. And you'll see other imperialists had different sections of the community. The French, the Catholic community in Syria, hence the Phalangist militia that we still see playing a part in the Lebanese war right up to the 1980s. And a significant part of the population today. The Russians, the Orthodox Christians, if you look at a map, you'll see there's an Armenian quarter, so-called, the Orthodox Christian quarter of Jerusalem. And the British singled out as being a section that they could use for their colonial interests, the Jewish population, and then sought to ally themselves. Theodor Herzl was seen, regarded probably as the originator of Zionism because of his role in creating the first Congress of the World Zionist Organization, which he got together in 1897 in Basel. The ideas predated him, and you can find Perez Smolenskin and Leo Pinsker, but it was Herzl who really, his special role was cutting the deal with imperialism that led to this becoming an abstract movement of no more significance than you and I in a room. Actually, probably we're of more significance if we really realize it. Two, something that was taken on as a viable project with real amounts of capital pumped into it by the very wealthy powers with the aims that we've seen. And perhaps it's just worth noting, just go back to that last one, sorry, that he wasn't fussy about who he would cut a deal with. So now we might think the Germans would be, how can Israeli make a deal with the Germans? Because we think of the German Holocaust. At the time, the people who really were committing pogroms and persecution of Jews were the Russians. But there are no, qualms about trying to make alliance with, essentially open anti-Semites. And really, the British who adopted Zionism, the British cabinet, the British ruling class, were profoundly anti-Semitic. They didn't do it through love of the Jewish people. They did it for advancement of their own interests. So Avi Shalom writes in Iron Wall that Herzl's most persistent efforts were directed at persuading the Ottoman Sultan to grant a charter for a Jewish settlement and a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but he also approached many other leaders and influential magnates. Among those were the Pope, the King of Italy, the German Kaiser, and Joseph Chamberlain, the British colonial secretary. In each case, Herzl presented his project in a manner best calculated to appeal to the listener. To the Sultan, he promised money. To the Kaiser, he intimated that the Jewish territory would be an outpost of Berlin. To Chamberlain, he held out the prospect that the Jewish territory would become a colony of the British Empire, which of course it did ultimately become. Fine. So, I mean, essentially the great power changed over that period of time of World War I and World War II, but that relationship remained constant, and it was ultimately the British who were the main champions. Right up to the time of the Suez Canal, at which point the US came to be the dominant power. There were many different organizations who started out the process of colonization. But perhaps what's key to note is that right from the beginning, even with their great amount of support, it was initially a very unpopular movement. It was a very unpopular movement with the actual mass of the Jewish people, who tended to be in the democratic movement, in the socialist movement, in the communist movement, and weren't really interested in settling Palestine, even with the considerable capital backing that they had from the beginning. The Jewish immigrants to Palestine, from the beginning, went there with the idea that Palestine was their birthright, that this was a land without people for a people without land. And right from the beginning, they took a supremacist attitude towards the local population and came into conflict with the local population. The local population of peasantry under the Ottoman Empire had their own problems. They had a shortage of land, they were relatively impoverished, and their desire at that time was for land. So landless and unemployed, they had to stand by and see while their land was sold by the government to all absentee landlords, to Jewish colonists, who then discriminated against them in terms of employment prospects locally. From the offset, the local trade union formed by the Jewish workers wouldn't allow Arabs to become members. So the working class was deeply infected with a apartheid supremacist attitude also. At all times, the Zionist colonists act as agents of imperialism. And under those circumstances, it was inevitable that there would be resistance of the local Arab population towards the settlers. The Zionists didn't recognize the existence of the Arabs or their right to remain in their own country, and they loudly proclaimed their intention of establishing their rule over the natives of the country, in which they were the self-invited guests. You know what? It's actually not too bad, is it? It's okay now. That's fine. Yeah. So they practiced racial discrimination against the Arab majority. Okay. So the Arabs had no real choice but to stand up for their right to self-determination. So when we see our media and politicians constantly present the Arabic population as intolerant, as anti-Semitic, as being full of racial prejudice, which they still do, they don't even really, it's a persistent feature of the current period when this genocide is going on before our eyes, that every pillar of the media, every interview starts by asking their interviewee to condemn Hamas, condemn October 7th. What do you think about October 7th? Isn't it disgusting? Aren't they anti-Semitic? Don't they want to wipe out? What about this river to the sea? None of them say actually from the river to the sea it's enshrined in the constitution of Likud, that it's actually a settler program, that they've come to a place that wasn't their country and are trying to wipe out and push out the local population. None of them speak about that at all. They don't even actually refer to the Palestinian people at all at the moment. They don't call it an Israel-Palestine conflict. They call it the Israel-Hamas war. If you look, it's that whole section of the paper will be called Israel-Hamas conflict. There's no mention of Palestine. Have you noticed that? That's just how they cover it. So only by totally ignoring that history can you get to that point. But it's clear from the actual facts that the racial strife was caused entirely by the intransigence, by the actions, by the crimes of the Zionists. Actually, if you can condemn the Palestinians for anything, it was in the first place being far too welcoming, far too generous, far too soft. It's their experience of struggle, discrimination, outrages committed against them that has steeled them. And the Nakba that we're witnessing now, I often think, is worse than the Nakba of 1948. It's more brutal. But the steadfastness, when they perpetrated the Deir Yassin massacre in 1948 and were able to drive 700,000 out of Palestine, The level of violence they have now, the carpet bombing, the schools, hospitals, mosques, UN facilities, food facilities, trying to starve the population, introducing famine, openly espousing their desire to wipe them out, treating them like human animals, in the words of Yoav Golan. It's worse. It's definitely worse. But the population refused. I mean, the heroism of the civilian population in refusing to leave is sometimes breathtaking. And I think we've got to salute and applaud that. There's a very beautiful book. And again, I don't know if I. Renap was called out in 1942 for being an anti-Semite, for putting this image on the front cover of his book. But what he said, he's a Jewish communist in 1942, long before October 7th, long before there was any Hamas. He said, what Zionism has done is to bring the old age cause of our people, the persecution of the Jews, which has been a real feature of European population, to Palestine. It has made them, the Jewish people, a buffer, or the Zionist settler population, a buffer between British imperialism and the anti-imperialist Arab nationalists, the very situation that Jews must everywhere and by all means avoid. And Harpal points out, and I think it's right, that the principal mistake actually made by the Arabic leadership was for a long time was to appeal to Britain to mediate between them and the Jewish settler population, to modify the behavior of the Jewish settler Zionist population. So not to recognize that actually you're talking to your enemy, not to recognize the real agents of their misery were the British and Americans. And we still see that today. We still see that today. People don't look at the situation and recognize, sorry to say it, Britain, USA, NATO are the real heirs to Nazism. They predated Nazis, they postdated the Nazis, their crimes are greater, they're the ones responsible. Where do the weapons come from that are causing the genocide? Britain and America. Who gives the people diplomatic cover to carry on committing the genocide? Britain and America. And until we learn this, until we learn that our country, our ruling class is the agent not only of our misery, but these conflicts, will make no progress. So a few more slides and we'll draw it to a close. But this is Lord Melchett, the founder of ICI, and this is a picture of him together with Lloyd. I don't know if you recognise this person. This is Lloyd George. He was the World War I Prime Minister, last Liberal Prime Minister, I think. And this is Lord Melchett, who's the founder of ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries, which AstraZeneca, for example, was one of the spin-offs of this. It was huge and influential imperialist company. So one of them, is a big enough guy that he can hang out with the Prime Minister. But he said the advantages of a Jewish settler state in Palestine to the British Empire are obvious. The security of imperial interests can be better assured by a large European population than by a few battalions of troops that can be spared. So as early as that, the far-sighted representatives of the foremost imperialist power of the day, Britain, regarded the creation of a Zionist state as the equivalent of having an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East from which to, not only interfere in Palestine, but all of the surrounding territories for the reasons we've outlined. This is a picture of the British conquest of Palestine, and always, I'm afraid to say, Indian colonial troops were used from the moment Britain landed in India. It learnt the benefit of recruiting Indian troops. More Indians fought in World War I than Europeans. More lost their lives. 1.1 million Indian troops fighting for the British fought, and it was the Indian troops that the British used, to conquer Mesopotamia. And there you go. There's my own proud forebears, the Sikhs, fighting under the British, going to liberate Palestine from the Ottomans. But actually, because the news of Zionism and the Balfour Declaration was suppressed, the Arabs at the time in Palestine didn't understand the designs of the British. They actually welcomed them as liberators in that situation. Okay, and here we see this is a photograph of Herbert Samuel with T.E. Lawrence in the area, actually in Amman. But right from the start, General Allenby, who was the general who went into Palestine, he assumed essentially rule of Palestine, okay? The mandate for Palestine, before it was given by the UN, it was assumed by the fact that Britain was the conquering army. And straight away his orders, his ordinances were issued equally in Hebrew as well as Arabic, despite the fact that the Jewish population was 8% of the population. And it was from this time, the British, from the time they entered Palestine, persistently acted to empower and create the Zionist state. and they did so despite all protestations from the Arabic population. And we mustn't neglect to mention the role of the Labour Party. You know, constantly in the left you'll hear talk that somehow the Soviet Union is responsible for the creation of Israel. I don't know how people come to that conclusion from, it's not really a supportable conclusion. Though at the time of the partition, briefly, many nations supported it on the back of the atrocities that had been committed in World War II. It's quite clear Britain created it, and the Labour Party, when they were running the empire, were very keen to prove that they were just as good as running an empire as anyone else. And Ramsay MacDonald, in the face of concerns about the levels of immigration, the Zionist settler population were always asking for higher quotas of immigrants to be allowed in so they could increase their settler expansion, and the British imperialists were in favour of that. During World War II, some concessions had to be made to win temporary peace with the local Arabic population and to persuade the Arabic population that the British were fighting on their side against the Ottoman Empire. But Ramsay MacDonald, you know, in the face of some of these debates, wrote to Chaim Weizmann, who became the leader of the Zionist movement after Theodor Herzl, to reassure him in a letter that he would uphold Palestine as the Jewish national home, encourage Jewish immigration and land settlement, and would condone the Jews discriminating against the Arabs in employment. That's the explicit letter. You can read it in the archives of the Israeli archives, actually state archives. I just read it before I came. I haven't reproduced the whole letter, but it's there. The Arabs refer to this as the Black Letter, but it's generally referred to as the MacDonald Letter by the Zionists. So, and as a result of this direct support, Labour and Tory and Liberal, of the whole colonial project, the Jewish population rose from 172,000 in 1931 to 1944, by the end of the war, more than 500,000. As a result of all of this, Palestinian resistance grew. It was initially led by relatively wealthy landowners, but it was ultimately wrested by the mass of the people. And there was a major uprising in 1936, I think, that's not clear there, against the Mandate and the settlers, which it was the British who took great care to suppress. And this picture, if you can see it in the background, is one of British garrisons who were used to suppress the Great Palestinian Revolt, 1936 to 1939. And in the act of suppressing the rebellion of the Palestinian people, several things were done. The Palestinian people were largely disarmed by the British, as well as suffering, I think, up to 5,000 deaths during that period. But in that creation as well, the Jewish settler, Zionist population, were armed to the teeth and taught to use very dark methods of suppression against the Arab population. In the process of that, special night squads were created, which are basically akin to SAS, really death squads, concentration camps, all of the usual techniques of intimidation, torture, massacre of villages. All of this was rolled out during this time. These methods of police brutality were taught to the settler population. They were organized in various militias, the Stern Gang, the Irgun, those groups that went on to have several tens of thousands of armed soldiers essentially under their command. Those groups acted in concert with the British and ultimately went on to become the foundation of the Israeli Defense Force. So when you look at the modern Israeli Defense Force, the brutality, the racism, the TikTok videos in which they make fun of the names, culture, and ill health of the population that they've put in those populations, that didn't come from nowhere. That's been a feature of the project since it was conceived, as the settler population first landed, as the Arabs were systematically dispossessed of their land, as their resistance was suppressed, right up to the present day. And we're building inexorably to the point where the UN ordered the partition of Palestine. And though at the time, on the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations, when they voted to partition Palestine, the Zionist movement had just 14% of the land, 1/4, which they basically bought or managed to acquire, 14%. So then the Palestinians had 86% of the land, right? So in 1947, despite all of this colonial project, massive as it was, it's a big inroad. You can imagine what would happen if a group, I don't know, let's say Australians. Let's say the Australians came to Britain, and in the case of, over the course of 50, got nothing against you, Vix, don't get me, but let's say in the course, probably reversing history, but I'm trying to create a neutral group. But say they came to Britain and acquired 14% of the land. That's quite a lot of the land. We won't talk about British land ownership. We could do that on another day. But it'll make a massive difference to the whole ownership structure and power balance of the country. You accept that? Yeah. It's not nothing, 14% of a country, it's massive. But so on the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations voted to petition Palestine and awarded them 48% of the land. It's someone else's land, right? But of course, they weren't saying, oh, this house now doesn't belong to you, it belongs to you. They were saying, this is where we're going to draw borders. This will be the Israeli section, this will be the Palestinian section. But what happened? Israel in reality was born, it sparked an orgy of pre-planned violence and terror. The Deir Yassin massacre happened as part of that orgy of terror. The Israelis, who were armed to the teeth by the British, trained in the most brutal techniques, were racist, supremacist, and a colonial entity, went on the rampage. And you can find videos, I haven't got them here, of the people who participated in that orgy of violence, laughing and joking about the atrocities they committed, putting babies in ovens, raping women, killing children, burning villages. Not my words, not making it up. Go and look at it. It's pretty appalling, it's pretty sickening, but it's not an isolated act. I'm afraid to say this is the stock in trade of colonialism. This is the way that you rob the wealth of a people. This is just one case. But in that orgy of violence, what actually happened, and you can see the red territory there was the partition plan. And what happened is that the Israelis went on their massacres, pushed villages out, uprooted and destroyed villages, and what happened was the green territory is what was actually left. Yeah? So almost immediately, Deir Yassin happened in April 48, and shortly after that, when the borders were, I think the ceasefire was the next year in 49, the borders that were left were the green borders. So from having 14% of the land, within 18 months, the Israelis were in possession of 80% of the land. And that is how they achieved it. That is where Deir Yassin comes from. That's where the massacre comes from. That's what was the use of the terror. This was a mass act of ethnic cleansing, violence, and terrorism. And it didn't end there. I'm just going to touch upon this, okay? So if these are the territories that was meant to be the partition, this is what actually happened, okay? And the Palestinian states, so-called, were actually annexed. So the West Bank initially just became part of the Jordanian state, one population. The Gaza Strip, as it was then, became part of Egypt. And it remained that way until the 1967 war, when, as a result of Israeli aggressive expansion, they actually took the whole of the Sinai Peninsula, which you can see is an area really bigger than Israel itself. And they kept that until the 1973 war. They also annexed the Golan Heights, which they still have. And they took direct control of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as part of Greater Israel. And from that moment on, the Palestinians lived under their rule. I'm going to, basically, this is where I'm going to kind of end the presentation in terms of, I'm not going to take that whole history forward. It was mainly my talk about the Deir Yassin massacre. The Deir Yassin massacre, I don't think, can be understood without the context of understanding what imperialism is. World War I, World War II, Sykes-Picot, and the whole project of implanting this settler colonial population. And when we understand this is the history, this to me is the antidote. It's a long presentation. It's a wordy presentation because it's a century of history. It's a century of history which our entire media seek to obfuscate, our political class seek to obfuscate in this apparent, isolated, ununderstandable action of October 7th. And they say that this was some kind of original sin in the face of which everything is possible, everything is allowable, everything is forgivable. Israel is defending herself. Israel is an agent of the British and the American for colonization and domination of the Middle East. Pure and simple. I just say before we can have a little bit of discussion. I'll just point out that in this context, we were. Christina mentioned that we've been arrested. We were arrested once for this book, which we're told was a racist book. It tells a history of Zionism, and it was Zionists who called us out for that. They've dropped that. No, so this is a fully legal book. You can have confidence holding it. You can make it, design it, take a picture of the front cover of the book, advertise it, and say with pride that this is just the truth. If history is racist, we didn't make that history racist. The racism of the Zionist settler colonial project, the racism of imperialism, the racism of colonialism, we stand against. There's no point trying to blame us for it, right? So that much is clear. This is the other thing we're arrested for, is this leaflet. So saying victory to the Palestinian people in their just war for liberation. And we're told that the wording of this, in particular, a specific reference to Alaska flood battle. So this October 7th amounted to calling for support for Hamas. And Hamas is a proscribed organization. It doesn't mention Hamas. It talks about the history of Palestine, something which is sought to be obscured in this question of, are you a terrorist, which is just nonsense. But what is very clear is that there's nothing terrorist in this leaflet. We're talking about the legitimate rights of a people to struggle for their national self-determination. So currently, 4 of our comrades are still on charges. Well, no, we're on bail, pending a charge under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act, which is calling for aiding and abetting for Hamas, which is a proscribed organization. That organization was proscribed, I didn't actually know it's prescribed, in 2020 by a signature of Priti Patel. Priti Patel, who apart from being a thorough racist to her core and a servant of imperialism, is thought by the progressive Jewish establishment to be an agent, an actual Mossad agent. That's what she's thought to be. I don't know if she is, I haven't seen the papers, but it wouldn't surprise me. She was shamed for her dealings of going and reporting directly whilst serving British Secretary of State, to Israel, and we don't know what deals and dealings she had with the high-level Israeli government. So these are people who are making the raising of your voice, speaking out against their crimes, illegal. Julian Assange languishes in prison for journalism and exposing their crimes. But this history, this litany of blood-stained history, doesn't even warrant a mention. It's okay, under the current circumstances, to be a member of the IDF. You can be a priest working in Sheffield University, you can go and commit God knows what crimes against the Palestinians, come back, be welcomed as a hero, straight back into your job. But if you walk onto the street and speak words of sympathy for the Palestinian people, the state will come down in repression against you. And you need to think very carefully, therefore, why that is. It's partly because, of course, they don't want the British people to wake up. But it's partly because they're feeling the extreme vulnerability of their situation. That for the first time, a mass of people, 500,000 people, 1 million people persistently are on the streets campaigning against their wars, far more than was ever achieved by the anti-Iraq War 2003 resistance. If you add up the numbers who are demonstrating, they're truly impressive. If you see the way there's very low faith in the Labour and Tory in their political system, they can feel that at a time of real political repression. And for that reason, in addition, I think, to their real problems of losing, I think Labour, they've just announced this snap election, haven't they? I'm fairly sure Labour will win the election. But it doesn't change the fact that there's just decreasing confidence in their entire political system, a deep crisis. And it's at this time we have to be very mindful that they also know how to dominate our political movement, to push into it proxies safe vehicles to take away the opposition. I'm quite sure that this election is going to be fundamentally fought on racist lines. Immigration is already the thing that everyone's banging on about. Rishi Sunak's desperate bid to, get flights going to Rwanda and all the rest of it. But at the same time, they do create these groups designed to look like you and push them into the movement as agents of false consciousness. So I don't want to dwell on it, but anyone who wants to discuss that, I think we can. Thanks so much for your attention, guys.
Ranjit, for reminding us who the real terrorists are, and not the people who are defending their land with, homemade weapons. They are the people with the suits and the language of peace and democracy. And thank you for contextualizing it for us so we understand British imperialism and its part, the part that it plays, our ruling class, they play this part. And unless we fight, we organize as a party, we convince more people to join us for the defeat of our ruling class, for the defeat of British imperialism, none of us will be free. Palestine will not be free. British imperialism as well as US imperialism have to be defeated. So we open the floor now for any questions that Ranjit will be happy to answer. Yes?
All complimentary.